My name is Minnie Caldwell, and I'm 32 now. But this story begins a few years ago, when I was the invisible daughter in a family that only valued the visible. My family thought they were setting up the town's most brilliant doctor with a perfect match, my sister. They meticulously planned every detail, every dinner, every social encounter. They never imagined his greatest discovery wouldn't be in his laboratory under a microscope, but hidden away in my dusty attic, surrounded by wilting plants and forbidden books. They thought they were curating a love story for the ages, but they ended up exposing a truth that would change all of our lives forever. Before I dive into the story of how my secret obsession became my greatest vindication, I want to connect with all of you listening right now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt overlooked or had your passions dismissed by the people who were supposed to support you the most, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for all the new viewers, make sure you subscribe to join this incredible community of people who truly understand. Our family, the Caldwells, were a pillar of the Oak Haven community, or at least that's the image my mother, Matilda, cultivated with the precision of a master gardener pruning a prize-winning rose. My father, George, was the quiet soil from which her ambitions grew, a kind but passive man who had long ago ceded all domestic and social strategy to his wife. Their prized bloom was my older sister, Isabella, and she was, by all accounts, flawless. Isabella had hair the color of spun gold, eyes the blue of a summer sky, and a laugh that could charm birds from the trees. She moved through life with an effortless grace that made everything seem simple, a gift she had been given at birth. Society adored her, and my mother treated her less like a daughter and more like a diplomatic envoy whose mission was to secure the family's legacy through a brilliant marriage. And then there was me. If Isabella was a rose, I was the stubborn, unidentifiable weed growing in its shadow. I was plain, quiet, and perpetually smudged with either ink or dirt. My hair was a nondescript brown, my eyes a hazel that never seemed to settle on a single color, and my natural habitat was a quiet corner with a book. From a young age, I understood my role in the family ecosystem. I was functional, not decorative. I made sure the house ran smoothly, that my mother's social events were flawlessly executed from behind the scenes, and that Isabella's dresses were always perfectly pressed. I was the stagehand for the grand performance of Isabella's life. The arrival of Dr. Francis Adams in Oak Haven was, for my mother, the equivalent of the heavens opening up to deliver a bespoke son-in-law. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a phenomenon. He had grown up here, the son of the town's previous much-loved physician, but had left for the best medical schools and research institutions in the country. He had published groundbreaking papers on cellular biology and diagnostic medicine, and now in his mid-30s he had returned. He bought the old clinic and was renovating it into a state-of-the-art facility. He was handsome in a severe intellectual way, with dark, intense eyes that seemed to see right through you. He was, without question, the most eligible bachelor the town had seen in a generation. For my mother, it was fate. The town's most brilliant doctor and the town's most beautiful woman. It was a narrative that wrote itself. Isabella, for her part, was pleased. She saw Francis as the ultimate social prize, a man whose prestige would elevate her own. She didn't particularly care what his papers were about, but she cared deeply about the weight his name carried. The campaign to win Dr. Adams began with a formal dinner invitation. The week leading up to it was a flurry of frantic activity. My mother changed the menu 3 times. I was sent to the city for a specific type of Belgian lace for the tablecloth, and Isabella had no fewer than 5 dress fittings. I, of course, was tasked with ensuring the silver was polished to a mirror shine and the crystal glasses chimed with the correct pitch. On the night of the dinner, Isabella was breathtaking in a gown of emerald green that made her eyes sparkle. My mother was the picture of a proud matriarch. I wore a simple gray dress and was instructed to help serve the meal to ensure our hired help didn't make any mistakes. When Dr. Adams arrived, the first thing I noticed was his exhaustion. It clung to him like a second coat. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes, when they briefly met mine, were startlingly perceptive. He was polite, of course, complimenting the house and my mother's roses, but as the dinner conversation began, a subtle tension filled the air. "Isabella, my dear, tell Dr. Adams about your work with the hospital fundraising gala," my mother prompted, her voice bright and commanding. Isabella launched into a detailed account of flower arrangements, seating charts for the town's most influential families, and the agonizing decision between a string quartet and a small jazz ensemble. "It's simply vital that the clinic feels like a part of the community, don't you think, Doctor? A place people feel welcome," she finished, smiling dazzlingly at him. Frances managed a tight, polite smile in return. Community health is indeed paramount, Miss Caldwell. In fact, I've been reading some interesting studies on the correlation between local agricultural practices and the rise in seasonal allergies. Has there been any significant change in the crops grown in the surrounding valley over the last decade? My father cleared his throat, looking lost. Isabella's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Oh, I'm not sure about crops, but the garden club is trying out a new hybrid of dahlia this year that is simply divine. The conversation continued like this, a painful dance of mismatched rhythms. Frances would try to steer the topic toward medicine, science, or local ecology, and my mother and sister would deftly steer it back to society, parties, and aesthetics. He tried again later, over dessert. I've been mapping the local flora on my morning walks, he said, a spark of genuine interest finally lighting his eyes. There are some fascinating species in the woods behind Miller's Ridge. I'm particularly interested in the prevalence of Digitalis purpura. Its medicinal properties are well known, but I'm curious about the local variance in cardiac glycoside concentrations. He looked around the table, a hopeful, searching look on his face. My heart gave a painful thump. I knew exactly what he was talking about. I had 3 pressed foxglove specimens upstairs, with detailed notes on the soil composition where I'd found them. I knew the local folklore warned children away from the plant, calling it dead man's bells. My mind was screaming the information, the questions I wanted to ask him, the observations I wanted to share. But I was just Minnie, the girl in the gray dress clearing away the soup bowls. I remained silent, my hands clenched tightly under the table. Isabella just laughed her charming laugh. Oh, doctor, you and your plants. All I know is that some of them are pretty, and some of them give you a frightful rash if you touch them. Now, about the color for the clinic's waiting room, I was thinking a soothing blue. Frances's face closed off. The spark of enthusiasm was gone, replaced by a polite, impenetrable mask. He endured the rest of the dinner with professional courtesy, but the life had gone out of his eyes. As I cleared his dessert plate, our fingers brushed for a moment. His skin was cool, and for a split second his gaze met mine again. In that look, I saw a profound and aching loneliness that I recognized as a mirror of my own. He was surrounded by people, admired by all, yet he was utterly alone in his intellectual world, just as I was in mine. After he left, my mother and sister were giddy with perceived success. He was utterly captivated, Matilda declared. He couldn't take his eyes off you, Isabella. But I knew the truth. He hadn't been captivated. He had been cornered. He wasn't looking at Isabella with adoration. He was looking past her, searching for something she could never provide. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to my sanctuary. The attic was the one place in the house that was truly mine. It smelled of dried herbs, old paper, and the faint acidic scent of chemical fixatives. It wasn't a girl's room. It was a laboratory. One wall was lined with shelves of meticulously labeled books: Gray's Anatomy, modern pharmacology textbooks, a well-worn copy of a university-level organic chemistry text, and several volumes on regional botany. On a long, sturdy table sat a second-hand microscope, glass slides, beakers, and a collection of notebooks. The walls were covered with pressed plants, each mounted on archival paper with its Latin name, location found, date, and detailed notes written in my small, precise script. And in a place of honor, on a small, clean section of the desk, were 3 papers published in prestigious medical journals. The author was Dr. Francis Adams. I hadn't just read them, I had devoured them. They were underlined, the margins filled with my own questions and annotations. His work on protein misfolding was elegant, his logic crystalline. He wrote about the human body as a complex, beautiful, and ultimately knowable ecosystem. Reading his work was like listening to a piece of music that my soul already knew. I sat at my desk and opened my current notebook. For months, I had been working on a single nagging problem, a persistent, irritating dermatitis that seemed to plague the children of the quarry workers. The local doctors, including Francis's own father, had always dismissed it as simple eczema, but I suspected something more. I believed it was a contact allergy to a specific type of lichen that grew on the granite rocks. Traditional remedies called for a poultice of jewelweed, but my own experiments showed that while jewelweed reduced the inflammation, it didn't address the underlying histamine reaction. I was trying to create a compound, a salve that combined the soothing properties of a local moss with a derivative I had managed to isolate from the bark of a particular willow tree, a natural source of salicylic acid. It was a painstaking process of trial and error, My notebook was filled with failed formulas, observations on viscosity and absorption rates. This was my real life, not the polished silver and the polite conversation downstairs, but this pursuit of an answer, this quiet, determined wrestling with a problem until it yielded its secrets. I looked at Francis's paper again, at his complex diagrams of cellular pathways. He was searching for answers on a grand scale. I was doing the same, here in my dusty attic, and in that moment, I felt an impossible kinship with the brilliant, lonely doctor. We were speaking the same language, just in different rooms. The town fair was my mother's next planned offensive. It was a major social event, a perfect casual setting for Isabella to be seen on the arm of Dr. Adams. Matilda orchestrated the entire day. She made sure they were paired for the three-legged race which Isabella, with her typical grace, managed to make look elegant and position them as judges for the pie-baking contest. I trailed behind, carrying the picnic basket and fending off my mother's critical glances at my practical mud-colored boots. While Isabella was charmingly debating the merits of a lattice crust versus a crumble top with Francis, I saw his attention drift. His gaze went past the brightly colored stalls to a small, unassuming tent at the edge of the fairgrounds. It was Mr. Hemlock, the local beekeeper. Francis made a polite excuse and walked over, his posture changing from one of polite endurance to genuine curiosity. I watched from a distance as he engaged the old beekeeper in an intense conversation. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the way Francis leaned in, his focus They weren't talking about honey, they were talking about propolis, the resinous mixture that bees produce. I knew from my reading that it had incredible antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. After a few minutes, I saw my own opportunity. Isabella was now surrounded by her friends, holding court. My mother was distracted by the mayor's wife. I slipped away and made my own way to the beekeeper's tent. By the time I arrived, Francis was gone, likely dragged away by my mother back to his duties as a social prize. I approached Mr. Hemlock, a man whose hands were as gnarled as old wood, but whose eyes were sharp and kind. "Excuse me," I began, my voice softer than I intended. "I heard you talking about propolis. I was wondering if you've ever noticed a difference in its composition depending on the primary forage of the bees. For example, if they are gathering more resin from pine trees versus poplars." The old man blinked, surprised. Usually people only asked him about the sweetness of his clover honey. He looked me over, really looked at me, for the first time. "That's a sharp question, Missy, a very sharp question. The pine-heavy propolis is darker, more brittle. I find it works better for sealing cracks in the hives. The poplar resin is more pliable. My grandmother used to swear by it for treating burns, said it drew the fire right out." We spoke for 10 minutes, a rapid-fire exchange about resin viscosity, flavonoid content, and traditional uses. It was exhilarating. For a moment, I forgot I was plain Minnie Caldwell. I was a researcher, exchanging data with a colleague. It was only when I saw my mother marching purposefully toward me, her face a mask of thunderous disapproval, that the spell was broken. "Minnie, what on earth are you doing? We've been looking for you. You're supposed to be helping with the picnic blanket." I mumbled an apology to Mr. Hemlock and scurried back to my family, my cheeks burning with shame. As Isabella looped her arm through Francis's and led him toward the quilt exhibition, I saw him glance back over his shoulder, his brow furrowed. He had a strange, puzzled expression on his face, as if he were trying to place a familiar song heard in an unexpected context. He had seen me talking to the beekeeper, and for a fleeting moment, I think he saw past the gray dress and the mud-colored boots. He saw a flicker of something else, something that didn't quite fit the picture my family had so carefully painted. A few weeks after the fair, a peculiar ailment began to ripple through Oakhaven. It started with the children, a scattered few at first, then a steady stream of them into Dr. Adams's new clinic. It was a rash, angry and red, that bloomed primarily on their arms and necks. It was intensely itchy, causing the children to scratch themselves raw in their sleep, and it was stubbornly resistant to the usual creams and ointments. Francis's modern practice was put to the test. He prescribed hydrocortisone creams, oral antihistamines, and soothing oatmeal baths. His treatments worked, but only as a temporary balm. The moment the treatment stopped, the rash would return with a vengeance. He was meticulous, taking samples, interviewing parents, trying to find a common thread. Was it a new type of soap, a change in the town's water supply? He suspected an environmental trigger, an allergen, but the source remained elusive. His professional frustration was a palpable thing, a topic of hushed gossip around town. The great Dr. Adams, the medical prodigy, was stumped by a simple rash. I knew what it was. Or rather, I was 95% certain. I recognized the specific pattern of the inflammation, the way it spread, the particular shade of angry red. It was the same dermatitis I had been studying, the one affecting the quarry workers' children. But this time it was more widespread, affecting children all over town, not just in one specific area. My theory had been that it was caused by a lichen on the quarry rocks, but this new outbreak invalidated that hypothesis. It had to be something more pervasive, something airborne. My mind raced back through my botanical notes from the past few months. There had been an unusually wet spring, followed by a sudden hot summer. Certain plants had flourished under these conditions. My thoughts snagged on one in particular, Veratrum viride, commonly known as American false hellebore. It was a beautiful but toxic plant with broad-ribbed leaves and a tall stalk of greenish-yellow flowers. It wasn't rare, but this year it had grown in unprecedented abundance along the creek beds and in the damp meadows surrounding the town. Its pollen was a known irritant. My research in the attic intensified, bordering on obsession. I would wake before dawn to collect pollen samples, dusting the fine yellow powder onto glass slides. I spent hours hunched over my microscope, sketching the pollen grains, comparing them to diagrams in my textbooks. At night, I cross-referenced old herbal guides with modern toxicology reports. The folklore books called it devil's bite and warned against letting livestock graze near it. The toxicology reports detailed the effects of the steroidal alkaloids it contained, which could cause everything from nausea to cardiac arrest if ingested, but said little about airborne pollen exposure. I was in uncharted territory, trying to connect the dots between historical anecdote and scientific evidence. My salve, the one I had been developing, suddenly became more than just a scientific exercise. The willow bark derivative, the salicylic acid, was a good anti-inflammatory, but it wasn't enough. I needed something to counteract the specific irritant in the hellebore pollen. I found a potential answer in an unlikely place, the common plantain, Plantago major, a weed most people ripped out of their lawns without a second thought. It contained a compound called aucubin, which studies suggested had powerful antitoxin properties. I began a new series of experiments creating a revised formula, a base of shea butter and beeswax for texture, the willow extract to reduce inflammation, and a highly concentrated infusion of plantain oil to neutralize the allergen. I created a control batch without the plantain, and a test batch with it. Then came the most difficult part of the experiment, the human trial. I couldn't ethically test it on anyone else. I took a small amount of the hellebore pollen I'd collected and created a diluted solution. With a deep breath, I applied a tiny drop to the inside of my wrist. Within an hour, a familiar red, itchy welt appeared. It was a perfect match for the rash I'd seen on the town's children. I documented the reaction in my notebook with a clinical detachment that felt strangely empowering. Then I applied my new salve. The relief was almost instantaneous. The itching subsided, and within a few hours, the redness had faded significantly. It worked. The knowledge was a brilliant, terrifying weight in my chest. I had the answer. But what could I possibly do with it? Walk into Dr. Adams's gleaming new clinic and say, "Excuse me, doctor, but you're wrong. The answer is in this weed from my backyard." The very thought made my blood run cold. I could already hear my mother's voice dripping with scorn and embarrassment. "Minnie, don't be ridiculous. Stop bothering the good doctor with your strange little hobbies." My mother, oblivious to the town's medical crisis and my own secret turmoil, decided it was time for another attempt at matchmaking. She planned a garden party, a grand affair designed to showcase the Caldwell home and, by extension, its most beautiful daughter. The day of the party was hot and oppressively bright. The garden was a riot of color, with my mother's prized roses blooming in perfect formation. I spent the morning arranging flowers and setting up tables, my mind a million miles away, replaying chemical equations in my head. When Francis arrived, he looked more tired than ever. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and the lines of frustration around his mouth were etched deeper. He greeted my mother and Isabella with a practiced politeness that barely concealed his distraction. Isabella, stunning in a yellow sundress, immediately took his arm. "Francis, you simply must see the new rose arbor. I helped Father build it myself." Which was, of course, a lie. She had done little more than point at a picture in a magazine while my father and I did the actual work. I watched them from the shade of the porch as I refilled a pitcher of lemonade. I saw Francis try, once again, to bridge the chasm between their worlds. "It's lovely, Isabella. Speaking of gardens, have you noticed an overabundance of false hellebore this year? The plant with the large, pleated leaves?" Isabella tilted her head, her expression blank. "Hellebore. Is that the one with the little pink flowers? I think Mother has some by the gate. No, Francis said, a weary edge to his voice. This one is tall, with greenish flowers. Its pollen can be problematic. His eyes scanned the crowd as if searching for anyone who understood the words he was saying. Isabella placed a delicate hand on his arm, her voice dropping to a concerned, syrupy tone. Oh, you poor thing, you're still worrying about that silly rash. You work too hard. It's probably just something the quarry children get from not washing properly. You shouldn't let it trouble you. Now, have you tried one of these little sandwiches? They're my favorite. I saw something in Francis's face at that moment, a shutter coming down, a final lock clicking into place. Her casual dismissal, her utter lack of empathy or curiosity, was the final confirmation of what he had likely suspected for weeks. He was in the presence of a beautiful, exquisitely decorated but entirely empty vessel. He excused himself abruptly and walked toward the edge of the garden, his back rigid. And then, he saw me. I had been so engrossed in their exchange that I hadn't realized I had wandered out onto the lawn. I was standing near a less manicured patch of the garden, staring intently at a cluster of weeds. I had spotted a particularly robust specimen of plantain and was mentally assessing its leaf structure. He watched me for a long moment, that same puzzled frown from the fair returning to his face. I looked up and our eyes met across the lawn. I felt a hot blush creep up my neck and I quickly looked down, turning my attention back to the lemonade pitcher as if it held the secrets of the universe. The tipping point came 2 days later. The baker's son, a sweet little boy of 6 named Thomas, took a turn for the worse. The rash had spread across his entire body. It was so severe that his skin had begun to crack and bleed. He had a fever and was crying from the constant, maddening itch. His mother, Mary, was a friend of mine. We weren't close, but we always exchanged pleasantries at the market. She was a kind, hard-working woman who was now at her wits' end. I heard the news from the postman, who told me Dr. Adams had visited the boy twice in one day and was consulting with specialists in the city, but nothing was helping. That evening, I sat in my attic, the finished jar of salve cool in my hands. I thought of little Thomas, his small body tormented by an ailment I knew how to fix. I thought of his mother's frantic, terrified face, and I thought of Francis, a good and brilliant man, being slowly defeated by a puzzle whose missing piece was sitting on my desk. My fear of my family's ridicule, of the town's disbelief, suddenly seemed small and selfish in the face of that child's suffering. My desire to help, a core part of who I was, finally overwhelmed my instinct to hide. I couldn't walk into the clinic, I couldn't confront Francis directly, but there was another way. That night, well after midnight, I crept out of my silent house. I took a small, clean glass jar of my salve. With it, I included a note. My hand trembled as I wrote it, but my words were clear and precise. I didn't write it like a home remedy recipe. I wrote it like a scientific abstract. I stated the hypothesis. The dermatitis was an allergic reaction to airborne veratrum viride pollen, exacerbated by this year's unusual weather patterns. I detailed the active ingredients in the salve: salicylic acid from Salix alba for inflammation, and a concentrated infusion of Plantago major, which contains the antitoxin aucubin, to neutralize the specific pollen-based alkaloids. I didn't sign my name. I couldn't. Instead, I simply wrote, "A theory for your consideration." I slipped through the darkened streets of Oakhaven, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached the bakery, where a single light burned in an upstairs window. With a shaking hand, I placed the jar and the folded note on the doorstep, knocked once, hard, and then fled back into the shadows, disappearing into the night before anyone could see me. The next morning, Mary found the small package on her doorstep. In her state of sleepless desperation, she barely glanced at the note. She saw a jar of what looked like a homemade cream, and on the principle of having nothing left to lose, she decided to try it. She gently applied the cool greenish salve to a small patch of Thomas's inflamed skin. Within an hour, the redness in that patch had visibly subsided. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through her. She applied the salve all over his small body. By midday, Thomas had stopped crying. By evening, he was sleeping peacefully for the first time in a week. The next morning, the rash which had tormented her son for weeks was almost gone. Mary, overwhelmed with a gratitude so immense it left no room for questions, did the only thing she could think of. She wrapped the half-empty jar and the slightly crumpled note in a clean tea towel and marched directly to Dr. Adams's clinic. Francis was in his office, staring at a pathology report from the city that told him nothing he didn't already know. He was tired, defeated, and starting to question his decision to return to this town where he felt so profoundly isolated. His nurse interrupted, saying that Mary, the baker's wife, was here to see him and was insisting it was urgent. When Mary burst into his office, her face was a mixture of joy and reverence. She unfolded the tea towel and presented the jar and the note to him as if they were holy relics. "Doctor, you won't believe it. It's a miracle," she explained, pouring out the story of the anonymous delivery and her son's incredible recovery. Francis listened patiently, his mind already formulating gentle warnings about the placebo effect and the dangers of unverified folk remedies. Then he picked up the note. He smoothed out the paper, his eyes scanning the first few lines. He stopped, his professional skepticism dissolved, replaced by a jolt of pure shock. He read the note again, slowly this time, his mind racing. This was no folk remedy. This was a peer-reviewed abstract in miniature. The confident identification of veratrum viride, the reference to its specific alkaloids, the stunningly insightful leap to using Plantago major as a targeted antitoxin. It was brilliant. The note even used the correct Latin binomials, capitalized and italicized perfectly. This wasn't the work of a village herbalist. It was the work of a scientist. A highly trained, deeply intelligent scientist who was, for some reason, hiding in his town. He looked at the salve in the jar, then back at the note. The handwriting was elegant, precise, with a slight rightward slant. It was familiar, but he couldn't place it. "A theory for your consideration," it was signed. The humility of it, paired with the sheer genius of the content, sent a shiver down his spine. Who in this town possessed this level of knowledge? He thought of the retired pharmacist, a good man but one who had never shown this kind of innovative thinking. He considered the high school biology teacher, but this was far beyond her curriculum. A sudden, fragmented memory surfaced in his mind. A quiet girl at a town fair, asking a beekeeper an incisive question about the chemical composition of propolis. The same girl, standing in a garden, studying a patch of weeds with the focus of a botanist in the field. Minnie Caldwell. It seemed impossible. She was the quiet one, the shadow. The family had presented Isabella as the prize, while Minnie was barely acknowledged, a piece of the household furniture. Could they have been so wrong about her? Could everyone have been so wrong? The idea was so preposterous that he almost dismissed it, but the puzzle pieces fit in a way that was too compelling to ignore. The quiet intensity, the flashes of focus he'd witnessed, the family's baffling insistence on pushing forward the beautiful but intellectually vacant sister. It all pointed to a secret, a hidden life. He knew he had to find out. That afternoon, he drove to the Caldwell house. He didn't call ahead. He walked up the familiar stone path and knocked on the door. Matilda answered, her face lighting up with a triumphant smile when she saw him. "Dr. Adams, what a wonderful surprise. Isabella's just upstairs. She'll be thrilled to see you." "Actually, Mr. Caldwell," Francis said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through her effusive greeting. "I'm here to see Minnie." The smile vanished from Matilda's face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. "Minnie?" she repeated, as if he had asked to speak to the furniture. "But why?" "I have a professional matter to discuss with her," he said, offering no further explanation. The silence that followed was thick with bewilderment. Matilda eventually, hesitantly, pointed toward the back of the house. "I believe she's in the garden." He found me near the old stone wall, kneeling in the dirt, carefully digging up a plantain root. My hands were covered in soil, and a smudge of dirt streaked my cheek. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't hear him approach. "Minnie," he said. My head snapped up, my eyes wide with alarm. He stood there, tall and imposing, holding a single folded piece of paper between his thumb and forefinger. The note. My note. My blood turned to ice. This was it, the moment of humiliation I had dreaded my entire life. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of accusation. I stared at the paper, unable to speak. My mind raced, searching for a plausible denial, but my face, hot with a blooming blush of guilt, had already betrayed me. I shook my head, a pathetic, jerky motion. I don't know what that is." He took a step closer, and his eyes were not angry. They were filled with an intense, burning curiosity that was far more unnerving than anger. "The handwriting is a perfect match to the labels on the jam you served at the garden party," he said softly. "The ones you made. Don't lie to me, Minnie, please." The quiet plea in his voice broke through my panic. I looked from the note to his face, and what I saw there was not contempt but awe. A fragile, tentative trust began to bloom in my chest. I swallowed hard and gave a single tiny nod. The breath he let out was long and ragged, a sound of profound discovery. "I need to understand," he said. "Everything." With trembling hands, I pushed myself to my feet, wiping the dirt on my apron. I couldn't explain it here, in the world of my mother's perfect roses. The only way was to show him. Without a word, I turned and led him back into the house, past my mother and Isabella, who were now standing in the hallway, their faces masks of shocked disbelief. I led him up the main staircase, and then up the second, narrower flight of stairs that everyone else in the family ignored. I pushed open the door to the attic. I heard his sharp intake of breath as he stepped inside. The late afternoon sun streamed through the single dormer window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a golden glow on my world. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply stood in the center of the room, turning in a slow circle, taking it all in. His eyes moved over the shelves of books, the rows of labeled jars, the meticulous diagrams on the wall. He walked over to my main work table and gently touched the cool metal of my microscope. Then his gaze fell upon the small stack of his own published papers. He picked one up, the one on protein misfolding, and his eyes widened as he saw my annotations in the margins. He scanned my notes, my frantic scribbles, my questions. He traced one of my diagrams with his fingertip. "My God," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to me, his eyes shining with an intensity that made my knees feel weak. "You understood." It was the most beautiful sentence I had ever heard. It wasn't praise or a compliment. It was a statement of fact, a recognition that resonated in the deepest part of my soul. "This note here," he said, pointing to a comment I'd made about a tertiary structure. "This is brilliant. I've been wrestling with this specific problem for 6 months. I think you've solved it." And just like that, the dam broke. The conversation that followed was an unstoppable flood. We didn't talk about the weather or social niceties. We talked about science. He asked me about my methods for the plantain infusion, and I explained my cold press extraction technique. I asked him about his research into autoimmune responses, and he drew a complex diagram on a dusty section of the floor to illustrate a cellular cascade. We argued about the merits of 2 different statistical analysis models. We finished each other's sentences. It was a conversation I had been waiting my entire life to have. In the middle of our rapid-fire exchange, the attic door creaked open. My mother and Isabella stood there, their expressions a mixture of horror and confusion. They were staring at a scene that their minds could not possibly process. The town's most prized bachelor and their plain, invisible daughter, huddled together over a stained notebook, their faces alight with a shared, ecstatic passion. "Minnie, what is all this junk?" my mother finally sputtered, her voice sharp with disapproval, gesturing vaguely at my life's work. "Dr. Adams is our guest. He's here to see Isabella." Francis didn't even look at them. His eyes were still locked on mine. "No, Mistress Caldwell," he said, his voice clear and resonant in the small space. "I am exactly where I need to be." The silence that followed Francis's departure was heavier and more suffocating than any argument could have been. He had stayed for another hour, completely ignoring my mother and sister as they hovered awkwardly by the door. He and I had mapped out a plan for a wider clinical application of the salve, and he had promised to bring me some proper lab equipment from the clinic. When he finally left, he had shaken my hand, a formal gesture that felt more intimate than any embrace. He held it for a moment too long, his thumb brushing against the dirt still ingrained in my skin. "Thank you, Minnie," he had said, and his eyes held a universe of meaning. Now, in the aftermath, my mother paced the pristine living room like a caged animal. "I don't understand," she kept repeating, her hands twisting the pearls at her neck. "What was all that? That clutter in the attic? Since when have you been playing with weeds and potions like some sort of witch?" The word playing was a dagger. This wasn't a game to me, it was everything. Isabella was silent, slumped in an armchair. She wasn't angry, not in the way my mother was. She just looked bewildered. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine hurt in her eyes. "He never looked at me like that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The whole time we were talking about the gala, about the clinic, it was like he was looking through me. But up there, with you, he saw you." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shrink or apologize. I stood straight, my hands still smelling of damp earth and plantain. "It's not playing, Mother," I said, my voice steady. "It's research. I study botany and its medicinal applications." My mother just stared at me, her mind unable to connect the daughter she thought she knew with the words I was saying. To her, I had revealed not a passion, but an embarrassing and incomprehensible eccentricity. But her inability to understand was no longer my burden to carry. It was simply a fact about her, like the color of her eyes. The power in our house had shifted, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a door opening into a hidden room. The next day, Francis returned. He didn't come to the front door. He came around to the back, to the garden, where he knew he would find me. He wasn't carrying flowers. In one hand, he carried a large, heavy box. In the other, a leather-bound journal. "A gift," he said, setting the box down. "And a proposal." My heart stuttered. He saw the look on my face and gave a small, wry smile. "A professional proposal, Minnie. For now." He opened the box. Inside, nestled in protective foam, was a brand-new binocular microscope, far more powerful than my old second-hand one. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "I want you to work with me," he said, his voice serious. "Not for me, with me. At the clinic. I want to build you a proper lab. We can research the local flora, document its properties, develop new treatments. We can publish our findings together. What you have here," he gestured toward the house, toward my attic, "is too important to stay hidden." Tears pricked my eyes. This was his courtship, not with empty compliments and social maneuvering, but with respect. He wasn't trying to possess me, he was trying to empower me. He saw my potential not as something to be admired from a distance, but as something to be nurtured and collaborated with. I accepted without a moment's hesitation. The town, of course, erupted in gossip. The news that plain Minnie Caldwell was now working alongside the handsome Dr. Adams at the clinic was a delicious scandal. My mother was mortified at first. She tried to spin it as me helping out with some charity work. But the narrative quickly slipped from her control. People saw us together. We weren't at the country club dances. We were seen hiking in Miller's Woods, carrying canvas bags for collecting samples. We weren't having romantic dinners at the town's fanciest restaurant. We were sharing sandwiches in his office, surrounded by open books and medical charts. And then there was the salve. Francis insisted on giving me full credit. We started producing it in small, controlled batches at the clinic, and it worked wonders. The Caldwell poultice, as the townspeople called it, became a local legend. Mothers stopped me at the market, not to ask about Isabella, but to thank me, their eyes shining with gratitude for healing their children. My vindication didn't come from my family's approval, which was still grudging and confused. It came from the quiet respect in Francis's eyes, and from the tangible good I was doing in the community I called home. I was no longer invisible. I was Minnie Caldwell, the researcher, and I was finally, truly seen. A year passed. The sign outside the clinic no longer read Adams Medical. It now read Adams and Caldwell Research Clinic. Inside, what was once a large storage closet was now my lab. It was small, but it was perfect. It had stainless steel countertops, proper ventilation, and shelves filled with gleaming glassware. Francis had been true to his every word. We were partners. Our days were a seamless blend of work and life. We would start our mornings with a walk, not for leisure, but for field work. Our conversation an easy flow of hypotheses and observations. Our evenings were spent in comfortable silence in his library, reading our respective journals, occasionally interrupting the quiet to share a fascinating passage or a vexing question. Our relationship had deepened from a meeting of minds into a profound and quiet love. It was a love built not on grand romantic gestures, but on the steady foundation of mutual respect, shared passion, and the simple, profound joy of finding the one other person in the world who spoke your language. We decided to host a dinner at our shared home, a small, sensible house on the edge of town with a large garden that was rapidly becoming an experimental botanical plot. We invited my family. It was the first time they had come to our home together, and the tension was a quiet but persistent hum in the air. My mother walked in and immediately began assessing the decor, her face a mask of polite critique. But something had changed in her, too. Her fight had gone out. The town's overwhelming respect for me, and by extension for Francis's choice, had left her with no ground to stand on. She was adrift in a new social reality she didn't understand. She even tried, in her own clumsy way, to bridge the gap. "The clinic looks wonderful, dear," she said to me while I was plating the appetizers. "I always knew you had a clever mind. You just needed the right person to bring it out of you." It was her way of taking credit, of rewriting history to fit her worldview. A year ago, it would have enraged me. Now, I just smiled. Thank you, Mother. I didn't need her to understand my journey. I only needed to have lived it. The biggest change was in Isabella. The shock of being so thoroughly overlooked for her plainer, quieter sister had been a humbling blow. It had forced her, for the first time in her life, to look inward. Stripped of the certainty of being the most desired woman in any room, she had to figure out who she actually was. And it turned out she was quite good at things. She had taken her flair for aesthetics and social organizing and started a successful event planning business. She was confident and happy in a way I had never seen before. During dinner, she turned to me, her expression sincere. "Minnie," she said, "I was talking to the mayor's wife, and she mentioned her husband gets terrible migraines. You know, with all your work on plants, is there anything in all that research that might help with something like that?" It was a small question, but it was monumental. It was the first time she had ever acknowledged my work as legitimate, as something that had value. It was a bridge, tentatively extended across a lifetime of distance. "There's some promising research on an herbal compound called feverfew," I found myself replying, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "I can give you some papers to read if you like." Later that evening, as my family was leaving, Francis came to stand beside me on the porch. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders, a comfortable, familiar weight. We watched my father's car pull away, its red tail lights disappearing down the dark road. I thought about the long, winding path that had brought me to this moment. My family, in their misguided ambition, had tried to offer Francis a prize, a beautiful ornament to adorn his successful life. They had completely misunderstood the man. He hadn't been looking for a prize to be won. He had been searching for a partner, a collaborator, an equal who could challenge and inspire him. He wasn't a bachelor looking for a hostess for his parties. He was a scientist looking for another scientist to share the infinite, frustrating, and beautiful work of discovery. And I had been there the whole time, hidden in plain sight, waiting in the attic. Francis squeezed my shoulder gently, as if he could hear my thoughts. He leaned in and kissed my temple. "What are you thinking about so intently, my love?" he asked softly. I looked up at him, at the brilliant, kind, and lonely man who had seen me when no one else had. "I was just thinking," I said, leaning my head against his chest, "about the fascinating science of being underestimated. Thank you for joining me and listening to my story today. It took me a long time to realize that my value wasn't determined by my family's vision for me, but by my own passion and dedication. My worth was never hidden in that attic. Only my confidence was. I want to know if any of you have had a similar experience. Share your story in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated, only to find that it became your greatest strength? I read every single one, and please don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding your own path. Sharing this video with someone who might be feeling invisible could make all the difference in their day. Remember that the people who are meant to be in your life are the ones who will see you, truly see you, even when you're hiding in plain sight. Thank you again for listening. I wish you all the strength and clarity in the world.